Stephen Davis.
Yeah.
I thought he wasn't here.
North Carolina, you're saying it's about time.
What are they clapping for?
Stephen.
But when it comes to a lopsided game, nothing competes
You got
in
recorded,
the
Steve?
history of football quite like that 1916 football game between Georgia Tech and Cumberland College. Well, the story behind this football game actually involves revenge, a baseball game, and a few $1,000s. The Smithsonian website catalogs it in their archives of interesting collegiate events.
How old is
From
Steve?
what I read, it took place in the growing football mania of the early 1900s. It's early and slowed down, hasn't it? Cumberland College played heavyweights like Tennessee and Louisiana State and Mississippi. But it really couldn't keep up. In fact, after the 1915 season, Cumberland discontinued their football program. Problem was nobody told Georgia Tech, and Georgia Tech had Cumberland on their schedule. If Cumberland failed to show up on the field, Georgia Tech was going to demand that they pay the forfeiting fee of $3,000. Back in 1915, $3,000 was big money. In fact, actually, to you and me, it's big money to this day, isn't it? They couldn't afford to lose that. Cumberland leaders tried to explain their dilemma to the Georgia Tech coach that they didn't have a football team anymore. But the Georgia Tech coach didn't care. His name was John Heisman. He would become the namesake of the Heisman Trophy. And he frankly wanted revenge for his Georgia Tech team in college. See, the year before, his college had been embarrassed when their baseball team lost to Cumberland by the shameful score of 22-0, only to discover later that Cumberland had padded its roster with some young professional baseball players. Heisman wanted to get back. So Cumberland was forced to piece together a team, and that job fell to the unfortunate student manager. He managed to get 13 players to show up, dress out, got on the bus, headed to Atlanta to play Georgia Tech. According to the New York Times, which even picked up the story, it didn't go well. When the game began, Georgia Tech scored on its very first play. Then Cumberland fumbled on their very first play, and Tech returned it for a touchdown. Cumberland fumbled again. The next time they had the ball, and Georgia Tech scored 2 plays later, and on and on and on and went. By halftime, the score was 126-0. But Heisman refused to let up. By the end of the game, Georgia Tech had scored 222 points to Cumberland's 0. The one event kind of summed it all up. The despair of this team that was literally beaten to a pulp. Toward the end of the game, the Cumberland quarterback, Ed Edwards, fumbled the snap from the center again. And as the Tech lineman charged into the backfield, Edwards yelled at his fullback, "Pick it up! Pick it up!" Edwards' fullback had been battered and beaten all afternoon, yelled back, "No, you dropped it! You pick it up!" What a grand day for Cumberland. But one of the problems we have as believers, especially living in this culture that we have enjoyed for so long, we have trouble getting the right perspective on Paul's intention as he writes his letters to these first century churches. We assume that the church is on the scoreboard, maybe assuming that it's in the lead, that the disciples are experiencing one undefeated game after another, or maybe since Paul started this church in Philippi 10 years earlier, it's been since then 10 championship seasons, one after another. Nothing could be further from the truth. At this very moment, Their leader, the Apostle Paul, is under house arrest. He'll be dead in 24 months. The wrong perspective brings us to treat this letter as if it's some kind of formula for happy-go-lucky Christians who just log one victory after another. And the truth is, Paul is going to refer to the way we should think. Perhaps even as we are taking a drubbing. This is the battle which effectively begins in our minds. He'll talk more about how we think than how we feel. In fact, this letter is a spiritual call to arms. It's going to be a letter to challenge them to continue developing as a local church with an inner resolve to stand for the gospel of Jesus Christ in a culture that will always field the biggest athletes and the strongest fan base and boast the more expensive programs and have the deepest pockets. The score on earth will never appear to be in favor of the Christians. Which is why Paul will write these kinds of words. A little later on in the letter to the Philippian church, he'll say, I want you to be children of God without blemish. In other